7:39 right now, and it's been 2 weeks since the NYPD busted a Queens man with an arsenal of weapons. 29-year-old Judd Sanson was arrested during a routine traffic stop when the cops made that discovery. Turns out that Sanson had expressed extremist views online. Now, investigators are taking a deep dive into his social media accounts to determine whether or not he was part of a larger plot. And domestic terror, one of the top priorities for New York's Homeland Security agency. And here to share more on what is being done to keep us safe is Commissioner Jackie Bray. So good to have you here this morning, Commissioner Bray. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
Of course. So let's talk first and foremost about that very case like we saw in Queens 2 weeks ago, right? You hear an arsenal of guns, immediately red flags go up. At what point does Homeland Security get in, and what kind of work goes into that investigation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, we should just commend the NYPD, right? They did a fantastic job stopping that individual and pulling them over. That investigation is ongoing. But what Homeland Security, what my agency really does is three things. Number one is we resource police departments all across the state and really first responders all across the state to make sure that they have the counterterrorism and intelligence tools that they need to do their jobs. Number two, we train people. We train people at our training center out in central New York. We host trainings about new technologies and new tools. And then finally, we set policy. And we try to direct people into the, sort of the next phase of this work. Right now, what we're really focused on is prevention.
Yeah, so when you hear, when you say those local units, like the counterterrorism unit of the NYPD is something that you work very closely with.
Yes.
Okay. So you have that threat assessment team as well that works all over the city. Can you talk about those teams and any potential threats that you're currently looking at within the state of New York?
The most interesting thing, I think, or the most concerning thing right now about the threat environment is how diverse it is.
Yeah.
20 years ago, we were really focused on foreign terrorist organizations. And we spent a period of time focused on homegrown violent extremists or extremists who were motivated by Islamic fundamentalist ideologies overseas, but working sort of as lone wolves here. And then over the last, say 8-10 years, we've been really focused on domestic violent extremism, those motivated by white supremacy, anti-Semitism. Today, we have to focus on all of them. It's all going on. What our threat assessment and management teams do is take the work and move it upstream. They move it sort of way left of boom, so that we're talking about individuals with behaviors that we think could lead to violence and intervening even before law enforcement could act.
Right, so were you involved, when you look back at the college protests that were taking place, right? Columbia University, let's zero in on them for a second. We kept hearing those terms of outside agitators, right? Was there ever, when you looked at that part of the Homeland Security aspect to it, of any of that considering being terrorists? Or terrorism?
Not on the campuses, right? Really, the campuses were, people protesting that then got to the place where, some of that crossed a line into hate speech, certainly crossed a line into, vandalism. But when we're talking about threat assessment, take Cornell this fall, had an individual on that campus that was making threats to the Jewish Center, making threats to Jewish students.
Yeah.
People around that individual knew that he was exhibiting behavior that was getting more and more concerning. We so often see in instances, particularly of mass violence, that there's breadcrumbs, right? That if you could connect those dots before something happens, you really could make a difference. And that's what our threat assessment teams are trying to do. Yeah,
because I read your recent article, your op-ed, where you wrote that people were associated with extremist ideologies. This number jumped out, 60% successful in carrying out some kind of planned violence. So when you look at that, I'm not saying that there were some threats made against Pride.
Yes,
specifically, absolutely. Which is happening this weekend, right? So can you talk about some of the threats that were made and how many of them were real threats? When you hear that number of 60% are successful in carrying out, I mean, it's an alarming number.
Well, let me say what that is, right? That 60% number is when someone takes action, they quote unquote successfully harm someone, right? They're injuring someone, they're killing someone. And what that teaches me is that mitigation and response aren't enough. So concrete barriers, right? Security cameras, really good locks, all very important things, necessary but insufficient.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is how do we stop people who are radicalizing from then mobilizing to violence? And that's about connecting the dots. It's about putting school counselors and law enforcement and large employers and faith-based organizations and social service and mental health all at the same table and sharing information. And so, that's really what we're talking about. When it comes to Pride, obviously the State Department put out some information, Homeland Security put out some information. I am confident that New York's Pride will be safe. I'm going to be there this weekend. I look forward to celebrating Pride. I'm confident that it will be safe, but certainly we have seen threats to vulnerable communities, and the LGBTQ plus community is a vulnerable community. We've seen spikes in violence directed there.
Are those threats that were made against the Pride festivities credible?
Well, when we talk about credible threats, what we're talking about really is does the individual who's making those threats have the means and the opportunity to act? And what I can tell you is that I'm confident New York Pride will be safe.
Okay.
I'm confident that the NYPD and their partners at the JTTF and the FBI are doing their jobs, and that we're all going to be okay this
July
weekend.
4th festivities, fireworks, big show on the west side.
Yeah. There's always a heightened risk when we're talking about large gatherings of people. But as New Yorkers, we know, I think, better than anyone else that we don't defeat terrorism by, changing our daily lives, right? We do that by making sure that we are out front with our values. And our values in this city, our values in the state are, ones that, unfortunately, whether it's Islamic jihadists and fundamentalists or white supremacists and anti-Semitics, they take issue with those.
Yeah, and some New Yorkers that I've spoken to were concerned with migrants that were coming in, and there's this idea that some of the folks that are crossing have connections to terrorism. How closely do you look at that?
We look at it really closely, very, very closely. And I think that the important thing is that President Biden has taken the action necessary to make sure that our southern border is secure. Governor Hochul's been really clear about this. We were quite disappointed, and I would say angry, that the bipartisan Senate deal didn't pass, right? That people voted against this bipartisan deal that would have been the largest investment in border security in certainly my lifetime.
Yeah.
But, the president has taken the action that he needs to secure the border at this point. That's a good thing for New York.
Okay. Commissioner Bray, great conversation here. You're welcome back anytime because there's so much
so
to
much
talk
for
to you
having me.
about, but we're out of time.